Four Corners and worldwide. Tune in to discover new music and to revel in the more familiar with no rules on genre, form, or novelty. Learn more about the origins of songs, the lives of the musicians that made them, and a wide array of interesting facts in general. It's freeform radio at its finest. Hear what you rarely hear anywhere else here on Radio Free Saturday mornings, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. every Saturday on KSJE.
KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, a community-owned and operated hospital. Here for you when you need us. From emergency care to routine checkups and screenings, caregivers are here and ready to provide the safe, high-quality care you need close to home. Online at sanjuanregional.com with the latest health information and resources to help you live life better here. Ten minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, the 6th day of January, 2022. Happy birthday, New Mexico. This is New Mexico's anniversary of statehood back in 1912, so 110 years as a state today. Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Michlin, and thank you for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM here in San Juan County, New Mexico. For our listeners in Durango, Colorado, we are working on getting our 103.3 FM frequency back on the air for you. But in the meantime, you can always tune in to our website and stream us anywhere else on planet Earth from Durango and elsewhere, KSJE.com. Welcome also to our viewers who are watching this visual radio program. It is streaming out live this morning to the KSJE Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And, of course, don't forget our Twitter account. So we're glad that you are with us this morning, everybody, because coming up, my guest is local archaeologist Paul Reed. He is with us, of course, from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins. And today we're going to be starting what we are calling an occasional series of programs this year, focusing on archaeology and Native Americans. And so we'll start our conversation this morning in the next few moments about that, and there's more to come throughout 2022, so we invite you to stay tuned for that. Then later on this hour at 8:50 a.m., I'll be talking with a professor here at San Juan College, Tricia Rickey, about a new class being offered later on this spring, an introduction to adventure therapy. And we'll learn more about that, how it fits into a hopefully future certificate here at San Juan College. That's coming up later on this morning, probably hitting the air about 8:45 or so, not 8:50, but that's coming up this morning as well. Next hour, Mick Hess will be here roving with the arts. He is playing some selections from Maurice Ravel. You'll hear that today after the news at 9:06. And don't forget, you can connect with us on our Instagram page in addition to Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And if you're a podcast person, you can subscribe for free to KSJE Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts for free. Of course, places like iTunes and Spotify and iHeartRadio and Pandora, and take us with you wherever your travels may take you during this new year. Outside our studios, partly cloudy skies this morning so far, 29 degrees in Farmington here at San Juan College. We're expecting a mostly sunny day today with a high of 47 degrees. Clear tonight with a low of 29, partly sunny tomorrow, but a bit warmer with a high near 50 on Friday. 31 overnight, then 46 for high on Saturday, 44 on Sunday, and 44 again with partly sunny skies on Monday, with overnight lows right around 30 degrees. Well, let me introduce my guest who is here with us this morning from his home in the Taos area. As I mentioned, archaeologist Paul Reed is here. Always great to have him on the show. Paul, good morning. Happy New Year.
Good morning, Scott. Happy New Year to you. So glad to be back on.
Thank you. Good to have you with us, and great to see you and have you here. And as I mentioned, we are starting out your idea, and I think it's a great one, to have this occasional series of programs dealing with the world of archaeology and Native Americans, because it hasn't always been the way it is today, I guess is a way of saying it.
Well, right. As we've talked before, archaeology, American archaeology is reorienting the way we do things and bringing in a lot more indigenous participants and perspectives. So, yeah, I thought it might be nice as we go through 2022 to have more contact with indigenous scholars. And this morning, we don't have anyone joining me, but as we go through the year, we'll have different guests and really try to bring some of those perspectives. As a non-indigenous person, I've worked a lot with folks in the Native American world, but there's really nothing like hearing perspectives from the folks themselves. So we'll head in that direction, and some interesting things to talk about today.
That sounds great. And you sent me an article, a link to a website about from an annual review entitled "Through Wary Eyes: Indigenous Perspectives on Archaeology," which I think kind of sets the stage for this conversation, right? Because I think a lot of Native American populations have been a little wary when wanting to work with or see archaeologists coming down the road.
Right, exactly. There's a long history of archaeologists and anthropologists, other researchers going into indigenous communities and sort of treating folks merely as study objects, extracting data, information, artifacts, and then disappearing without any renewed contact with those communities, without any discussion about the implications of research, benefits to that community. So this is, as we've talked at different points, sort of a long overdue process, I think, to redress the role of archaeology in Native communities, and how to really, not only get over and work past, and in some cases probably apologize for prior, acts and processes, but look towards a different future where Native communities, indigenous communities can really take, full control of how their heritage is studied, how it's presented in the public media. So this article by scholar Joe Watkins, who is from Oklahoma and a Native person, and has been the president actually of our Society for American Archaeology. Joe brings a really unique perspective to this, being in both worlds. I thought that would be nice to, use to kind of frame this and kick off some more discussions. And I know that with the folks that I'm hoping we can have on over the next few months, we'll get some very interesting perspectives on this.
Indeed. And I think it's maybe worth saying that some of these things that you describe in the world of archaeology were part of the norms of the time. I mean, we're talking 100, 200 years ago, aren't we? 50 years ago, and so I think as we learn more and become a little bit more critical about how some of these things were done, we're addressing some of that in your field as a lot of other professions are doing.
That's right. I mean, there's a long history of, sort of encountering of people of European descent in the country, encountering Native folks, with a whole lot of bias, and this is part of the historical record. It's not so much about looking back and saying, we should try to change the past. We can't change the past. What we need to do is understand how the past has influenced where Native communities and people are today, and how to move forward with, some appropriate changes, and how to do that in a truly collaborative environment. So not so much about, well, we need to fix these problems in this vacuum here, or, sort of the classic ivory tower of scientists and academicians, but let's actually engage communities, see what it is their needs are from a cultural perspective, from a heritage perspective, from other research perspectives, and let's try to figure out how to do research in the future, if that's what we're doing, or work or consultation, in a respectful way. So it's a reworking of all that, and not, honestly, I don't think a lot of time spent beating ourselves up about what our forebears may have done, but we do have to acknowledge what things that did happen and be really honest about that. So that's a perspective that I think we can take.
Right. And used a word there that I want to pick up on, which is collaboration. I think that's really important as well, because again, for a number of years, a lot of these tribes and governments and peoples were not even offered a seat at the table to talk about some of these things that were being discovered going on in their communities, with a direct historical relationship to their cultures today. And I guess that's maybe one of the other big changes, that moving forward, we're seeing a lot more collaboration with Native American governments and tribes and cultures and things along that line. You've talked about that before on this program.
Right, that's exactly right. I mean, the long history, again, not to dwell excessively on it, is of different governments. The Spanish government initially in the Southwest, the Mexican government, the American government, coming to indigenous tribes, to native groups, and saying, here's going to be the new policy. In many cases saying, we're going to fix everything from the past. It'll all be wonderful and great. And in most cases, we know it didn't turn out that way, actually. So at this point, we're seeing a whole lot of empowerment at political, social, economic levels in tribes. And, with the Indian Self-Determination Act that was passed many years ago, and a whole lot of other things at kind of the larger governmental level. And then, with my field, which, is not the most important thing to a lot of people, but it is very important for tribes to have a lot of control over how their cultural practices are viewed, how their history is viewed, how they are allowed to continue cultural practices without intrusion, without unnecessary study. So these are the things that we're talking about. And again, as we've talked on the show before, Scott, I think it's a very exciting time to be in my field, and to be engaging in true collaboration and looking towards different futures with groups. So I'm excited. I'm very excited about that.
Right. And I am too, because I know we can kind of pick on your expertise and your connections with others to bring them onto the program as well, other Native Americans and other folks in this area to give us their perspective on this topic as well. So I'm looking forward to that. And thank you for offering to do that on this program as we go forward this year. One of the things I wanted to ask you about too, Paul Reed, that we've talked about is this, again, I think a major milestone is the NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. You and I have talked about that numerous times, but that was another big change in policy, right, from the National Park Service and the federal government?
Right. This is a 1990 law that essentially said that museums and other research facilities could no longer just hold the ancestors of modern tribes in museums without addressing, the concerns about that, talking to the tribes who are the descendant communities, and then coming up with a plan either to return remains to tribes for their own disposition, or to go through a process where a museum or an institution takes on a repatriation and reburial process, if that's appropriate. So yeah, this has been huge over 30 years. The numbers could be better, and that's a criticism that I definitely have for the larger community in the museum world. But at this point, something approximating 60% of the folks who had been held as of 1990 have been repatriated and reburied. There's definitely more work to be done here. And, as we've talked in the past, museums can be reluctant to go through these processes. We've set up museums over a couple 100-year process in America, inheriting approaches from Europe, primarily England and France and the like. And museums want to hold on to objects that are deemed to be important culturally. Now, holding on to human ancestors is a huge problem and a travesty. And, we're working through that process to move that along. But there's been a lot of successes as well. I've worked closely with Solomon Ruins Museum, for 2 decades now. And one of the things we were able to complete last year was a full repatriation, reburial process with all the ancestors that had been excavated from that site and from some in the region. And so I'm very pleased to have worked with the staff there, with Executive Director Larry Baker, and with 6 different tribes closely working with us and giving input, suggestions, and being able to complete that process. So I'm optimistic that some of the other museums, and not so much in our region, I think most have gone through this process, but nationally, again, there are still tens of thousands, literally, of Native American ancestors who have not been reburied. So this is a process that needs to continue to accelerate. We talked a little about some changes to the NAGPRA law that are going through a process now at the Park Service and in the Department of Interior. And one of those is to sort of get around what I think many of the tribes consider a loophole, which was putting individuals into a culturally unaffiliated category, which had the effect of allowing museums and institutions to continue to hold on to human remains, ancestors, endlessly in their collections, because they said, we don't know who this person might belong to, which modern tribe, would claim this individual as an ancestor. So the reforms that I think are going to take place this year will allow tribes in a region to say, well, we're not sure we can prove a direct affiliation, which was one of the burdens, honestly, put on tribes by this legislation. But let's go ahead and go through a process of repatriation, reburial anyway. So that's a big plus. And a lot of the groups, a lot of the tribes I work with are very excited to see this move forward. So I think that's going to help as we move forward.
Good to know. And so how would that work, Paul Reed, if there isn't a direct line, I guess, to a modern day tribe or Native American government? There's a consortium of folks who might agree that these remains deserve to be in this location geographically?
Yeah, it definitely is not an easy thing. If museums have individuals who might have been found in a large part of the West, for example, or multiple states. But what the reforms are talking about is, again, dialogue, consultation, collaboration with tribes, which is a huge part of NAGPRA. And basically, if you're in an area, say you're on the plains of Colorado, then you talk to Northern Cheyenne, you talk to Arapaho, you talk to Lakota or Sioux individuals, and you say, we have these individuals and we would like to go through a process of repatriating. If there's a group that can step forward and say, we will take the lead in this, and then we would like to choose a site that's secure, that's remote, to conduct a reburial or to set it up for the tribes to do their own reburial, which is typically what happens. And so then that process moves forward. And this has been completed successfully in many, many places, in every one of our states at this point. So I think this is something that can happen. But museums, I think, in many cases, wanting to follow the letter of the NAGPRA legislation and the law, have been hung up or stuck on this notion that we don't know which tribe we should specifically repatriate to. And I think that is in part an unintended consequence of the way that the legislation was drafted and put together. And especially with this, again, this culturally unaffiliated category, which has proved really problematic. So, the solution is these are the geographically affiliated tribes today in a region. Let's consult with those folks. Let's go through the process. The NAGPRA program through the National Park Service has funding to complete the work out at Solomon. The institution was granted a nearly $70,000 grant to bring tribes in to talk, to consult, to go through that entire process. So there is adequate funding available. So that can't be sort of the factor holding back museums at this point. So again, I'm optimistic that this can happen. It is pretty complicated if we're not sure exactly which tribe might be willing to make that claim. But if the museum assumes a posture from the beginning that they're going to go through this process and they intend to do a repatriation or reburial, and they make that very plain to the groups they're talking with, it's my expectation, and again, this is based on some of my own personal interactions, that if the museums do that in good faith, they will be able to find a solution and to, complete this process. So again, I'm optimistic about that.
Right. Understood. And Paul Reed, I know, this topic is somewhat sensitive when it comes to Native American tribes. We're talking about death and remains and things along that line. So that's also part of this delicate conversations that are being made as well, isn't there? I mean, we know, I feel familiar with some of the Navajo traditions about that, but I imagine maybe other tribal entities feel the same way.
Yeah, I think that this has to be approached with a great deal of sensitivity. But again, that really should be part of, the initial set of meetings that an institution or a museum would have with tribes, saying, we understand this is a very uncomfortable topic, and we're not wanting to go into areas that may be inappropriate to discuss. So, but that's part, I think, of the openness of people on the museum side, or if it's the federal government consulting, saying, we'd like to do this in the most sensitive way. So instead of sort of the old style, Euro-American big brother government or institution saying to the tribes, here's what's going to happen, we turn that around and we say, how would you like to see this process unfold? And then maybe there's a tentative plan put forward, which is what we had done at Solomon, saying, here's a process we'd like to go through, but we would like to get your input on it. We'd like to deal with this with sensitivity. If there are areas that are not to be discussed, then let's talk about that so that we can put those into a category and say, this is not something we're discussing. here's where we want those discussions to lie. So, again, I think it's a reorienting from, we are the people in charge at the museum, the institution, the government, to we'd like to empower the descendant communities, the tribes, to come to us, with funding for tribal members to come and visit places, to understand. When we did our process at Solomon, we did tours of the site at Solomon. We took folks to Aztec ruins if they wanted to go. In a couple cases, we went to Chaco Canyon because we saw this as a much larger process than just, what could be construed as a fairly narrow, we're trying to repatriate, rebury, and do the right thing under the NAGPRA legislation. For us, it was a much larger cultural process. And I think that if other museums and institutions try to adopt, that framework as much as possible, that they can have good outcomes too. And it's not that there won't be moments of, discussion. It may be that some of the tribes are not agreeing completely on how things should go. And, that bears discussion, and you have to go through those processes. But again, I think that this can be done, and it really requires the right attitude on the part of the institution and then the individuals in that institution who are chosen or selected to lead the process.
Sure, understood. And so at Solomon Ruins, as you mentioned, that has just completed this process, I guess my question would be, if more discovery is done at Solomon and there are other remains that are discovered, then this process would be followed once again. I guess it's not really an end necessarily. It's an ongoing situation, is it not, in case other things are found down the road?
Yeah, it definitely could be. But I think one of the things we have to take into account is, in terms of the work that was done at Solomon, substantial excavation work was done in the 1970s. That process stopped by 1980. There have been a couple of discoveries, even at the time since I've been there. Those haven't involved human remains, but other artifacts or items, because room walls collapse sometimes, and there are things you have to be concerned with. So it's certainly possible that other human remains, ancestors, could be found at the site. But with the current director, Larry Baker, and, really the approach that a lot of archaeologists and institutions are taking, we are not intentionally doing new excavations in sites, particularly when we have, as the case, as is true at Solomon, we have 1.5 million artifacts and lots of materials that are available for study. Of course, we published a 3-volume report in 2006, followed up with a book, articles, and a whole lot of other things. But the point is, from the standpoint of the type of archaeology that, the group I work for, Archaeology Southwest, tries to pursue, we call it preservation archaeology. We don't need to do a whole lot of new excavations. We may not have to do any additional excavations at all for years to come, because we already have all these data in the form of the artifacts themselves, samples, and then studies that have been done in the case of Solomon for 50 years now. So, there won't be new excavation work at the site at Solomon. It's unlikely that would happen at Aztec, Chaco, or neighboring national parks. There are salvage projects that happen that can result in human remains being found. But I think it's fairly safe to say that this process at Solomon is, over 99% completed, and anything that would happen in the future would have involved the same pathway of careful consultation and collaboration with descendant communities who have expressed an interest in being part of that process. But the large scale part of this is finished, and that I think feels really good. I think Director Baker, the Solomon board, other members in the community that we've talked to, and the tribes that we've had close contact with, everyone is very happy that process has been completed.
Right. Very good. And I feel the need to point out, of course, that San Juan County is the owner, if you will, of Solomon Ruins and their stewardship. And so all this is possible under the county's guidance as well. So
exactly. No, thanks for pointing that out, Scott. And the county was great during this process. The CEO of the county, Larry, was in close contact the whole time. And they've been very, very supportive of this. So big shout out, as you said, to San Juan County for doing this right.
Right. Indeed. And I guess at these sites, Paul Reed, and I think you've told me before, but, the folks, when they were buried or when they had members of their community who passed away, they were all placed in close proximity to each other? Was it there? I mean, there's certain sites at these areas, or certain areas at these sites that were kind of burial places for the population as people would pass away. Isn't that kind of what you found during your studies?
Yeah, there are specific areas that in different sites were set aside in some cases for multi-generational placement of individuals as they pass. So, we could call them cemeteries in some cases inside, sites, in some cases outside. So yeah, they're definitely, pretty firm cultural practices in place.
Which means if you found one area, you probably found most of the folks from that one area, I guess.
Right. If a room had been completely excavated, we could say with some certainty that there wasn't, if that room was going to be revisited for one reason or another, that other individuals were unlikely to be found. But substantial portions of many of these sites have not been excavated. So, and those are the ones that, I feel strongly, and really most archaeologists do at this point, that we leave those places alone in perpetuity. And the other thing that we've talked about a little on the show, Scott, is we have in 2022 an amazing array of remote sensing devices, ways to detect things. One of the guests we had on in the past was Kellum Throgmorton, recently completed his PhD, now works up at Crow Canyon. Kellum did some amazing work at a number of sites in the area, using magnetometer, which reads magnetic, disturbances below ground, and soil resistance, and was able to do amazing reconstructions of what lies beneath the ground on sites where you have visible surface architecture and where you don't have in other places. So, that's just an example of what we can do these days with these remote techniques without literally putting a shovel in the ground. And so there's a lot of opportunities to learn a tremendous amount about sites, and even sites that in the past we would look at as disturbed and perhaps not holding much research potential. These remote techniques can tell us a lot about what's going on, and in those cases we don't have to dig into those sites. So that's a significant advance for archaeology.
Definitely. But your work does continue, of course, whenever there is like new construction or disturbing of the earth in some areas, whether it's a road project or a construction project, a building or what have you. There is written into the law archaeological studies, right, and discovery and things like that. I think we heard a bit more about it recently in Colorado with the expansion of Highway 550 into the Durango area. Several locations, I think, were discovered, maybe the ones that were unknown before the construction, and so these will all kick in, right? These types of consultations and ideally should kick in if a new site is discovered with remains, right?
Right, absolutely. So this is a field that's, in archaeology, we call it cultural resource management, or CRM for short. Folks call it contract archaeology. So in the case of the road up in Durango, right, they knew they were getting into that. They did an archaeological survey. They'll go in and do limited testing, excavation work to try to sort out how to put a road in, and then avoid as much as they can of those archaeological remains. But then ultimately, if the engineers have committed to a particular path, if there are remains in the way, then the archaeologists will excavate those carefully, and then the road can go in. So, yeah, a lot of the new excavation work that does happen in the country, countrywide really at this point, is happening in the CRM realm, in that contract archaeology realm. But folks are also coming up with new techniques there as well. And I think there are cases where, in the past, larger areas were cleared. And I think, just from different standpoints, there are more attempts to do less invasive archaeological work to really, just clear that particular right of way, and also to involve indigenous groups and tribes in those different processes. The Navajo Water Supply Project out to the west in the Chusca Valley is one that I think, has broke some new ground there. This is a Bureau of Reclamation project that's unfolded now over a decade. And BOR, for their part, had committed a lot of funds to this and, to the cultural work. So they were able to bring out 4 or 5 different tribes to do different aspects of work with traditional cultural places on landscapes. In one case, the team from the Pueblo of Acoma that I've worked with surveyed almost 90 miles of that pipeline right away. And, one of the things I like to point out to folks is, archaeologists see certain things on the landscape when they do work. Indigenous folks, native folks see different types of resources, which aren't always super apparent to the archaeologists. So in that specific case, the Pueblo Vacama team doubled the cultural site count for that nearly 90-mile segment.
Wow.
So it's clear that as we approach this, that archaeologists are trained well, we see what we see, but there's a whole nother realm of resources out there that are tremendously important to tribes. And these are things that, we need to incorporate into the daily work that gets done if groups are putting in, oil pipelines, oil well pads, if they're building water lines for different projects, really any kind of ground disturbing activity. One of the things that we've talked about a lot is how to involve tribes in this, particularly in areas that different tribes would consider of greater sensitivity. And, back to our work around Chaco, right. This is something that I think BLM Farmington is now doing much more actively in trying to have, local Navajo families who are on the landscape, be consulted before an access road goes in, before, oil or gas wells are staked out, to see what might be in that area. So I think there's some really good and, substantial reforms taking place there to protect places that, I as an archaeologist, other archaeologists are not even going to see potentially before a development project would impact or destroy them.
Gotcha. Well, Paul Reed, it's fascinating work. Again, I'm always intrigued by our conversations and looking forward to more of them, especially with this kind of occasional series, as we were mentioning, for 2022 of talking about archaeology and Native American governments and tribal entities in the area and across the country. And I know you'll bring some great guests with you every month when you can. So we'll look forward to that and tell folks, as we say in the radio business, to stay tuned.
Right. Great, Scott. Yeah, I'm excited. I think we're going to learn a lot. I try to do what I can to elevate the voices of groups that I've worked with, but there is nothing like hearing from the folks who are doing these things directly. So I look forward to that. Me too. Well, and we look forward to your contacts as well to bring them to our audiences. So thank you for that, Paul Reed, and thank you for today. We will talk to you again in about a month. Great. Thanks, Scott. All right. Thank you very much. That's Paul Reed from Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest, my guest this morning here on KSJE. KSJE is supported by the Farmington Civic Center, bringing a full slate of entertainment to Farmington and San Juan County. Broadway music from the Sharp Family Singers, Saturday, January 8th at 7:30 p.m. The Farmington Civic Center, 200 West Arrington in downtown Farmington. Find out more online at fmtn.org/shows or at 505-599-1148.